It's been a while since I uploaded a video about a movie, and I thought it was time to review Troy. Which came out in 2004. It stars Orlando Bloom, Eric Bana, Brad Pitt, Sean Bean, Brian Cox, and it's a good movie. I'm not sure who the main character is played by. It seems like they make the main character Brad Pitt's character. Which doesn't actually come on until a few minutes into the movie, which is really surprising. And I'll say this about this movie. Sean Bean's character doesn't die, which is also surprising. No one really dies in this movie. It just has that flair. It does have a love story between Helen of Sparta and Orlando Bloom's character. Which also seems more like a main character in this movie. If you've seen it. This is a Warner Brothers studio movie. So yeah, Warner Brothers worked on this. And it's a fairly violent movie when they're fighting. The story is about the Spartans and the Greeks going to war over Helen. There's a double love story going on in the entire of this movie. Eric Bana and Orlando Bloom play brothers in this movie. And the chemistry between them is clearly good. Orlando Bloom had either just recently gotten off of Lord of the Rings or Pirates of the Caribbean when he was in this movie, and this is one of the more forgetful movies with lines like The Patriot is, in that respect. Brad Pitt plays Achilles, which is actually more like a god. Yeah. The first scene in this movie is the best scene. The first scene with him in this movie is probably the best scene to describe the way his characters are. They're in his movies, they're either eating or stuck up. Or start with him sleeping with a woman, as this movie does for his character. And Sean Bean acts Odysseus in this movie. I think Brian Cox plays either Agamemnon or Menelaus. See, I'm even forgetting this movie while filming this video. I love this movie score. I like the film score. It's a film score by James Horner, like Braveheart and Titanic. It's the third James Horner score I've covered on this channel. Before this movie, he worked on Patriot Games, then he worked on Sneakers, then he worked on Braveheart, then he worked on Titanic, then he worked on this one, then after this one he worked on Avatar, and then before Patriot Games, he actually scored 2 or 3 of the original 6 Star Treks, including The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock. And he also worked on Aliens, which I surprisingly haven't seen. But James Horner is among one of the greatest at writing film scores. This movie doesn't have very many notable themes, though. Like all movies of this era, there's a song performed by an artist during the credits. And the artist is Josh Groban. He also did a song for Polar Express. But I prefer his song in this movie over his song in Polar Express. Partly because it fits my range more when I want to sing it, you know? And yeah. Now my favorite part of these videos. Talking about the runtime and the rating. As I mentioned before, this is a very violent movie. as you can see here, it's rated R for graphic violence and some sexuality and nudity, which there is actually some nudity. Oh, you'll blink and you'll miss it. And the film is 162 minutes long. Again, another almost 3-hour film with a perfect score. I didn't know this prior to the film, but Odysseus and Achilles are related. They're cousins. Achilles ends up, spoiler alert, Achilles ends up dying in this movie. Yes, it takes place in ancient Greece, as you can see from the title. Troy. It won Oscars. It has a pretty good film score. By James Horner. Less memorable than Titanic and Braveheart, which I find to be funny because, like, out of the films he's done, his memorable music is his older movies. Star Trek, you don't even know that it's James Horner who wrote the music. But Braveheart, I think he'd finally found out his craft, and then Titanic, again, using that same craft. Troy, though, this movie score isn't that memorable. The lines are less memorable too. Like, the only line I remember from this movie is, "Do you love me, brother?" Or whatever it was. I don't even remember what the line was. Yes, I'm not as familiar with this movie. Not a shock. Not a shock at all. But, yes. This movie is a good movie. And you should watch it. I recommend it. Yep. You should consider owning it. I own an old-fashioned, okay? But this movie is really ridiculously good, even if it's not as memorable as others.